being encouraged to find alternatives to public transport and getting to work. But in the push to get us back on our bikes, are rural areas being left behind? Here's Tom.
Welcome to Britain's bike boom. To help prevent the spread of coronavirus, the government has said people should avoid taking public transport where possible. So, across the UK's cities, the race is on to get people back on their bikes.
But are we missing a trick here? Could coronavirus lockdown have led us to the brink of a rural cycling revolution?
The government is fast-tracking £250 million to improve cycling and walking routes. But in the past, towns and cities have got the lion's share of funding for cycling. Annual council investment in rural cycling is less than half that of urban areas. £4 a head compared to £9. And after coronavirus, improving rural cycle routes could be an economic necessity. The National Association of Estate Agents says they're seeing an unparalleled increase in demand for homes in rural areas. Because lockdown has proved that living near the office isn't a necessity.
The lockdown has shown us that much work can be done without going into the city. And after the virus is quashed, many of us are likely to continue working like that.
So if we're living our lives more locally, that could mean using our bikes not just for leisure, but for essential business too. Bike sales in April were up on last year by an astonishing 50%. Here on this already popular path between Bristol and Bath, they're racing against time to get ready for a predicted 1 million extra trips this year. So will these changes lead to a long-term gear shift? Nigel Wrigler is president of ADEPT, a national association that advises the government on environment, planning and transport.
I think people are very much reconnected with their local area, and I think cycling is giving them a real opportunity to rethink how they live their lives, how they access work, how they access the high street, how they get their kids to school. You can do some of those tasks you would have historically done in your car, you can easily do on your bike in a rural area.
And the need to make high streets coronavirus safe is accelerating the trend towards bike-friendly towns. To give more space for social distancing, many towns are exploring closing their high streets to cars. There'll only be one type of vehicle allowed, the bicycle.
Up and down the country, councils are starting to think through what can we do with our high streets in terms of reclaiming some of that road space for pedestrians and cyclists, and using temporary measures to make sure that people can engage economically and socially in town centres in a safe way that's compliant with the COVID guidance.
So it may be time to turn our attention away from cities to the 50,000 towns up and down the UK. Towns like Thornbury, where the council recently announced plans to shut the high street to car traffic. Toby Savage is the leader of the council here in South Gloucestershire.
I think there are some lessons that we're going to want to take from this pandemic and some things that we're going to want to keep for the future. And I think actually that reduced car use, that being more open to walking and cycling and healthier ways to get around, we absolutely want to capture that and keep that.
If these plans outlast the pandemic, they'd represent the biggest change to our high street in decades.
How would it work somewhere like where we are right now?
So we want this pavement space to be given over for tables and chairs and for traders to be able to do their business. And then the road itself, we then want people to be able to walk on and to be able to cycle around and to be able to maintain that social distancing.
Now, the emphasis on making market towns more cycle-friendly does raise a question. How do those in outlying villages get there? The village of Rudgway is 2.5 miles away from Thornbury, but for cyclists, getting there involves chancing it on a busy A-road.
This is a very common issue with many of our cycle lanes, only separated from the traffic by a strip of fading paint and coming to an abrupt stop.
Once off the main road, you're then faced with a downhill route filled with blind corners, so those coming to town by bike may arrive with their nerves a little jangled.
Places like this want to get an economic boost by making their high street more pedestrian and cycle friendly. But I have to say that getting here by bike was a wee bit hairy.
Some areas, including Thornbury, are planning to improve cycle routes between towns and villages. But in many places, rural cyclists risk more than a flat tyre. You're more than twice as likely to be killed while cycling on a rural road than an urban one, because collisions are more likely to involve high speed.
The fact is, if we're going to make cycling to work or school a viable option for many people in rural areas, then those cyclists are going to have to feel safe.
Rural cycling risks are a worry to one group in particular: parents. Felix Edgeworth is a bike-mad 8-year-old in Gloucestershire. He wants to cycle to his school when it reopens, but his dad worries it's too dangerous for him to cycle alone.
On a morning, this is the bit that worries me. It's a blind junction, dangerous in a car and certainly on a bike as well.
The speed limit on these narrow country back roads is 60 miles per hour, and the designated passing places are often in a terrible state.
Coming up to one of the few passing places on the road here, but as you can see, you don't really want to be forced onto the side here by a big car.
It's the same in many rural areas, a vicious cycle of underuse and underfunding. So what's the solution? Well, some point to outdated rules on rights-of-way access. This path near Farnham is closed to bikes, so cyclists have to use a busy road. And this is by no means an anomaly. Scotland has a right to roam law which lets people go anywhere responsibly, but only around 20% of rights-of-way paths in England and Wales are open to cyclists. Wales has proposals to open up more routes, but there are no such plans for England. Roger Geffin from Cycling UK argues that the government should step in to give money to landowners to open up more of their land to cyclists.
We could be using some of the subsidies for farmers, for landowners, will replace the Common Agricultural Policy to incentivise farmers to open up these rights-of-way for cycling so that we can then have a much more coherent networks.
The government told us that they are committed to increasing people's connection with the environment and are continuing to drive action in this area. Roger says that with a little willpower, whipping the rural cycle network into shape is within reach, with the help of some new technology.
But for those who are making that slightly longer journey, or people who are older with health conditions, people with disabilities, there is a solution at hand. It's known as the e-bike, the electrically assisted pedal cycle. It's not become widespread in this country yet, but it's rapidly taken over cycle sales in more cycle-friendly countries like the Netherlands, Germany, Belgium. And it could be an absolute game changer because it eats up distance, it eats up hills, and it is such fun.
E-bikes use battery power to make it easier to cycle up hills and cover long distances. But does the humble bike really need an overhaul? Well, if you're NHS nurse Amy Barrett and your commute is a 10-mile trek through the Scottish Highlands, the answer is yes. The new technology allows her to have the benefits of cycling without some of the drawbacks.
I live in a wee village 10 miles outside Abbeymoor and try and cycle both ways most days. I find that cycling to work really sets me up for the day and energises me. And then being able to cycle home lets me kind of decompress from the day. I do struggle though to cycle 20 miles a day on top of a day's work. So I've recently been lent an e-bike and it has made such a difference. And I get to work nice and refreshed from being out in the fresh air, but not exhausted.
E-bikes are pricey right now. Amy was lent hers by a charity, but if their cost comes down over time, they could give a big boost to rural cycling. Before then, the solution lies in our hands.
This does feel like a moment of opportunity for cycling, but seizing it means we have to make sure that people feel safe. We have to give space to cycling on both roads and in the countryside. Also, we have to acknowledge it takes a little bit of effort to get on your bike.